We're incredibly excited to have an amazing lineup of panelists here this morning to talk about the current landscape related to legislation and regulation. We're happy to have on stage with us John Hudak of the Brookings Institution, Lauren Rudick of Hiller PC, Deanna Clark-Esposito of Clark-Esposito PC, and Shanel Lindsay of Ardent Cannabis. Todd Mitchem will be joining us from TMC Partners to moderate the discussion. But first, we're going to have John Hudak from the Brookings Institution piggyback on a little bit of what Tahir was talking about to talk about the current and kind of history of the regulation and legislation space. And then we'll turn it over to Todd to moderate a panel discussion with Q&A at the end. So, John, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invitation here today, back to my home state. My bio hasn't been read, but I can proudly say as a fellow nutmegger, I am also an alum of the finest educational institution in this state, the University of Connecticut, so it's good to be home. And so I'm going to pick up a little bit where Tahira left off with her great discussion of, I don't see Tahira. Yes, there you are. Of the history of cannabis. She covered about, 40,000 years in hers, and I'm going to cover about 22. So I promise I'll be a bit shorter. Where Tahira left off, she talked about California taking that first step toward legalizing cannabis for medical use. And really the core of the motivation for that ballot initiative in 1996 was actually the AIDS crisis and what was going on, particularly in the Bay Area, but in other communities around California, as individuals were desperate for some sort of help for a variety of ailments during the end stages of AIDS in order to improve the quality of life for those remaining months that individuals, particularly gay men, but others, were experiencing. And it drove this grassroots movement to push forward and to put on a ballot initiative in 1996. For the first time, the question of not for the first time, but the first time it was successful, the question of legalizing cannabis for medical use. Interestingly enough, that ballot initiative, which was expected to tank all along the way, as the federal government spoke out against it, as every statewide elected official in California spoke out against it, actually got more votes than Bill Clinton did when he got reelected the same night. And it showed that motivation. It showed what California was able to do. Anyone who has lived in California, anyone who's worked on a ballot initiative in California knows it's really hard to do anything at that scale in California. And this grassroots movement was successful. And other states began to look at that and say, maybe we can do that too. And early on, a few states that did this, some were libertarian, some were more liberal, but what they were doing was building coalitions of people together and recognizing a few important things about the drug war. One is that it's failed. Two is that it's extraordinarily expensive. Three, for some people, it cuts into individual liberty. For others, it cuts into the type of personal liberty that a racialized public policy takes away from you. And medical marijuana began to spread, largely at first in the American West, but now to 29 or 30 states, depending on how you count Louisiana and the District of Columbia. And so, why did this happen? This is an important question that comes up a lot. How did this happen? Why did this happen? Even though this is absolutely in violation of federal law by any standard. And it happened for a few reasons. First, states noticed that the sky wasn't falling in California, that there might have been wildfires, but the state wasn't on fire. That all of what the naysayers were happening, many of them in the Clinton administration, many of them in state government, that those fears and those warnings actually didn't turn out to be true. And for those of you who have studied marijuana policy, particularly medical policy, you look at this and you say, well, if the sky wasn't falling in California, which had, by most estimates, the most lax regulations in this space, well, we might be able to do it a little better, and the sky's not going to fall here either. And so that's what happened. States learned from states what we want the American system of federalism to do. And so as you move forward in time over 2 years, 4 years, 8 years, and now 22 years, you're seeing models improving upon each other. But there were other reasons why this changed. over time. Brendan put up the data earlier about changes in public opinion. In the early 90s, public support for legalization of recreational marijuana was under 20%. Today, it's about 64%. That happens for two main reasons. One, people are more comfortable with marijuana, either because they've experienced it in the past, or they are seeing it in their communities legalized and regulated, and they're not alarmed by it. And the other is because of generational replacement. The people who support legalization the most in the United States are millennials. The people who dislike legalization the most are people over the age of 65. I'm a political scientist. What we say about people over the age of 65 is that they're exiting the electorate. They're dying. And they're being replaced by people who have about 80% support for marijuana legalization. It's true on the rec side, it's true on the medical side as well. And so what we have now, as stated earlier, is 29 or 30 states plus DC with medical cannabis reforms, full-fledged systems, and 8 or 9 states now in DC with recreational systems. And what that has done is it's created 3 important challenges, I would say. One is an extraordinary federalism challenge, what I consider the most compelling federalism issue of our time, as states have looked at federal policy, said this is absolutely broken and we can do better, in violation of federal law, of course. Second is an enormous regulatory challenge. States on both the medical side and on the recreational side had to start regulatory models early on from whole cloth. They didn't have models to look at. When you think about 2012, November of 2012, when Washington and Colorado passed recreational marijuana reforms for the first time, they had a medical system in place that was pretty lousy, both of them, and they had to expand this system to now regulate heavier and regulate in a slightly different way what they were doing on the medical side before. They didn't have a model to point to internationally or within the United States. They had to do this themselves. And then there was a technological change, which in large part was related to the regulatory change, but it was largely internal to the industry. How do we get the technological capabilities that we have today to serve this new industry? And so on the regulatory side, states stepped up. They've done really good jobs, not perfect jobs for sure, but they've done really good jobs at creating this regulatory system. And when you think about what states do, usually you think about what states do poorly. Cannabis regulation is not something they've done poorly. It's something, again, they've learned from each other, they've built on systems, they have done trial and error, they have tried their best to overcome some of the problems in their systems, and they've done effective jobs of that. On the technological side, the private sector has stepped up. Brendan did a very good job of talking about what his company has done for this industry, which I think is significant, and most people in the industry, even his competitors, I think if you gave them truth serum, would tell you that he's done remarkable things. But others in this industry have stepped up as well, trying to find solutions to get around banking problems and a variety of other issues that exist. On the federalism issue, though, the federal government has not stood up. It has stayed seated, or it stuck its head in the sand. The early solution for this federalism problem was to say, we're going to crack down on businesses. And the Clinton and Bush administrations and the Obama administration did for some time. After that, there was a realization that this had gotten too big. In the Obama administration, developed what came to be known as the Cole Memos. And the Cole Memos, most of you are familiar with, essentially took duct tape and wrapped it around federal policy and said, this is going to work, sort of. And what it effectively was a policy of non-enforcement in compliant states with reforms. What it did not do is really solve all of the problems in the system, but what it did stop was large-scale federal intervention. And in that sense, it was effective for this industry to expand. But the Cole Memo was, of course, temporary. It was only as good as the president in office. And as I said, it was incomplete. Fast forward a little bit, you have the 2016 presidential campaign, where you have two general election candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, who publicly have the most progressive cannabis positions in the history of American government in terms of two-party presidential candidates. And you think, well, it's going to work out pretty well. And in fact, I would argue that Donald Trump had the most progressive public position on cannabis policy in the 2016 campaign. And he might still, who knows? But the man he appointed Attorney General does not. And Jeff Sessions earlier this year rescinded the Cole memo and issued what I guess could be called the Sessions memo, which essentially gave license for U.S. attorneys to jumpstart enforcement against recreational marijuana states, not medical marijuana states, because they are protected under a congressional rider. But what it has done is injected some uncertainty into this space. And we're going to talk a bit about that uncertainty in a minute. It creates uncertainty for state governments, for regulators, for business owners, for consumers, and frankly for other federal officials as well. Ultimately, if you like marijuana policy as it is in the United States, the Cole memo is a disaster. If you oppose cannabis policy in the United States, I said the Cole memo, the Sessions memo is a disaster. If you hate cannabis policy as it is, the Sessions memo is also a disaster. Sorry, for years and years of saying Cole memo and it rolls off the tongue, saying Sessions anything doesn't, but especially the Sessions memo. And so the Sessions memo is bad policy. There is better policy out there that we're going to talk a little bit about. But ultimately, when you look at the policy landscape right now, we have a very bizarre system of federalism dealing with cannabis policy in this country, and it has only been made worse by an activist attorney general who doesn't know anything about law enforcement capability that he runs, and he also doesn't know a damn thing about cannabis. So I'm going to end there and bring Todd up.
Okay. Hello. Can you hear me? Yes. Wonderful. My name's Todd Mitchem. Before we get started, I let the panel introduce themselves briefly. Thank you, by the way, for that. That was great. I'm managing partner and founding member of TMC Partners. We run government affairs, community outreach in states like Colorado and all over the U.S. And we're also currently working with the federal government, both at the Treasury level and at the IRS level, to deal with tax code 280E. Which those of you who know what that is will know that's going to be a great burden to relieve, hopefully, and trying to reverse and change the required SARS filing for the banking industry, which is really, considering President Trump asked all of his departments to pull back on certain functions. We're hoping this can be one of those functions we get removed, which would be a removal of the SARS filing for companies that have legal licensing and are compliant in their state. So fingers crossed on that. Before we get started, though, I want to tell you that I was giving a talk to a group of youth prevention experts about marijuana, and one of the questions I got was, how do you terrify your children around the consumption of marijuana, since I have 3 kids? And after I choked on that question for about 8 seconds, I said, well, why would I terrify them for something that could be literally the biggest economic boom in their lifetime? 13-year-olds today will most likely graduate high school in a world with massive legal cannabis, with job opportunities we can only imagine today, thanks in great part to work by folks you've heard here today, including Mr. Kennedy himself, who was up here earlier, and we're very proud of that. I just want to say this, that what we're talking about today is about culture, it's about government, it's about community outreach, and it's about a focused effort to reform these areas, because as we legalize very quickly, if we don't focus on these areas, as my panelists will talk about today, there are massive unintended consequences that can and will occur. There's talk all over the United States in cities like Detroit and other cities that are asking the question, when this industry moves in, how will we ensure that our population will get a fair share and be able to be a part of it and not be forgotten and pushed aside? These are all serious issues that we all deal with up here. The way the panel structure will work is I'll have everyone introduce themselves briefly. I'm going to ask them some questions. I may do some follow-up. I may push back a little bit, have some fun with it. And then at the end, we're going to take questions from the audience as well. So if you have a question, something really important to say, and you want to ask that question, don't panic. You will actually get a chance to do that in an orderly fashion. I will just end with this before I turn it over to our panel. I've done a lot of great things since leaving the business world in 2013 and coming into the cannabis space. I've also made a lot of mistakes, and I certainly don't have near the pedigree of anyone standing here. If I had told my parents at the age of 16 I'd be speaking at Yale someday, they would have been like, oh, that's adorable. But then if I had said, but I'll be speaking about weed, they would have said, oh, that makes sense. So thus, here we are, aren't we? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panel, let them introduce themselves. We can skip over John, who's already had a chance up here. But I'm going to let the rest of our panelists just tell you just briefly about themselves, and then we'll launch into it. Okay, go ahead.
Sure. Hey, everybody. My name's Deanna Clark-Esposito. I'm the principal at the Clark-Esposito Law Firm in New York City. In addition to this area, we also have an import-export related practice and one involving fashion. What else? I guess I'll keep it brief. That's it.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lauren Rudick. I'm a partner at the Manhattan boutique law firm Hiller PC. I represent primarily investors and startups in the cannabis industry. I originally came to the cannabis space through my mother's end-of-life care. I'm also one of the lawyers who brought a very massive federal lawsuit against Jeff Sessions in the DEA and the DOJ and United States Congress. Thank you. And we are seeking a declaration that the Controlled Substances Act, as it pertains to cannabis, is unconstitutional. We just had oral arguments on Wednesday, so I'm sitting here on pins and needles waiting for a decision. Yes. But thank you all. Thanks for being here, and I'm really honored to be here and speak at Yale. This is a dream, so thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shanel Lindsay. I am from Massachusetts, and as my label says here, I'm from Ardent Cannabis. That's my company. We make a decarboxylating machine, cannabis technology, but my life is really one part cannabis business and one part cannabis policy. So I helped to draft the adult use initiative that passed in Massachusetts. I also am counsel for the Mass Patient Advocacy Alliance, which is the main stakeholder in the medical marijuana program, and I was appointed to the Mass Cannabis Advisory Board. And in that role, I focus on small business and access for people who have been marginalized and chair their market participation subcommittee.
All right. So panelists, thank you again for being here, and we're going to talk a lot about those issues. I have some Jeff Sessions questions, by the way. We deal a lot with his office. But just to get us started, everything's changed really in the last few decades. I would even argue that in the last 5 years, we've had quantum leaps, right? So this is really for anyone on the panel, but where do you see this going in the United States? One of the things Brendan talked about earlier, I think is so true, that the world seems to be hyperactively moving beyond the United States. And even though arguably some states are really taking huge moves, what do you think the landscape is currently, and where do you think this is going, and how fast? Anybody can jump in.
You want to take it?
Well, I think that you see rapid movement on the East Coast. We were just down testifying in New York about cannabis movement. We've seen Vermont move really quickly, and I think that what we saw in Massachusetts is once one state legalizes, all the states around really are forced to start addressing the issue, especially when you're talking about adult use, because they know that the economics are going to lead many people to that state, and the realities of losing the tax revenue that come from cannabis become very real. And so I think regionally, we've seen a lot of movement in the Northeast after Massachusetts and Maine took the leap into adult use. We also see a lot of movement internationally as well. But the nuances of cannabis legalization, I think, are just as important as it moving quickly. So I'm sure we'll talk about that more, but it's not just about pushing legalization, it's about pushing the right form of legalization. And pushing forward without that in place can lead to those unintended consequences that you mentioned earlier.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I would agree with Shanel in terms of the states, but so whenever you're dealing with imports or exports, we're dealing with federal law, U.S. Customs, or outbound would be Department of Commerce. And I can tell you, in terms of how fast are we moving, it's not nearly fast enough. I came into the industry because of a company, a foreign company, They wanted to import, they have a domestic company here as well, and they were interested in importing a product. This product happened to fall under an exception in the DEA's own regulations because of the type of product and the consumer as well. But the difficulty it turns on risk and the uncertainty, which they've both touched upon. Why would I want to spend the money here when I have all these other countries I can go and spend my money in and not have to worry about the door shutting on my business? So it's definitely not moving fast enough.
Yeah.
I think it's obvious that we are headed on a trajectory toward national level legalization at some point. Public opinion doesn't lie. Policy changes that are happening at the state and even very slowly at the federal level tell us that. But one of the challenges, and I think from the outside of this industry or this policy space looking in, you say, well, if 64% of people support recreational cannabis reform and about 90% of people support medical reform, why hasn't that reform happened? And the issue there is the difference between public support and the salience of public support. A lot of people like the idea of marijuana reform. No one cares about marijuana reform. Gallup has been asking, what are the top 20, what are the most important issues to you since the 1960s? They list the top 20. Cannabis has never been in the top 20 in all of that time. And the reason is that people don't necessarily see it as something that is affecting them or connecting to them. And so what this movement has done, though, is diversified what it is about. It's not about freedom. It's not about racial justice. It's not about corporate opportunity. It's not about our standing in the world. It's about all of those things. And the more that gets diversified, that people can adopt it and connect to it, the more people are going to care about it. And then that 64% or 90% support actually begins to put pressure on elected officials to wake up and actually respond to their constituents who elected them.
Yeah. I think, another reason why the world is progressing so quickly and the United States is behind is because of the Controlled Substances Act. We have the Controlled Substances Act, which is rooted in racial animus. There's something much more sinister going on in this country. The Controlled Substances Act was designed, to penetrate communities of black people who, used cannabis as their drug of choice. It was used as a tool to break up protesters who were opposing the Vietnam War. We have former officials from the Nixon administration, some of whom are still alive, who are even testifying in our lawsuit to go so far as to say that the Controlled Substances Act really had nothing to do with public safety and rather was rooted in this racial animus and a desire to suppress First Amendment rights. So we have that political obstacle in this country, which I don't think exists in other countries. And it's quite unfortunate. But I think as we'll get into a little bit later, the federal government has taken steps since 1970, as you mentioned with the Cole Memo, and to sort of induce the American public into participating in a state legal cannabis industry. And we'll sort of talk about that as a case for legalization.
Yeah. So I just have a follow-up question to that, and then I have another question for Lauren in a second. But so we talk a lot about that model that, I've heard now two of you talk about the, whatever the federal model is going to look like from a legalization perspective. I know we hear a lot that there's a conflict between the medical and the adult use or recreational front. There seems to be this educational conflict. Mm-hmm. So how do you, on this panel, see really moving the narrative forward towards legalization without dealing with that conflicting message? Or just in general, how do you see the model working, both social justice or any areas you cover?
It's so easy to get behind medical cannabis, right? Almost everybody in this room probably either benefits from medical cannabis or knows someone who has. We've gotten to a point where, with children with epileptic disorders, they've really changed hearts and minds. But it's gotten to a point where we have to sort of evaluate. You can't pin yourself into a medical marijuana model because then you don't address the underlying reasons why the Controlled Substances Act was enacted in the first instance, and we can't box ourselves in. But what's interesting is medical cannabis opened the door to recreational or adult use cannabis, and in turn that has opened the door for more states to consider medical cannabis. So I think that the two play off of each other very well. And I'm looking forward to see how states experiment in that regard, and that's one of our most basic fundamental principles of federalism. Allow states to have the freedom to experiment with what works best for their constituents. So federalism is another victim of this failed war on drugs. So I'd like to see that change soon.
Anyone else?
Well, I'd like to see the federal-state conflict resolved in a way that leaves the choice up to states with how to move forward. I'm concerned about the push by the pharmaceutical industry to deschedule or reschedule cannabis in a way that would lock it up and create barriers for companies and patients through the FDA. So I think that the route that folks should be pushing for is either descheduling cannabis or handicapping the ability of the federal government to move forward. I think that things like the Reefer Act that would essentially eliminate any ability by the federal government to push forward and interfere with states would be a kind of quick and easy solution. I think the concern there again is pushing for full federal legalization, but doing it in a way that doesn't then create more problems for us.
But I might want to call it the Meta-Creational Act or something. Blend it all together. So other question, what are the policy questions you guys are seeing, the most pressing issues? I know social justice is one of those hot button issues right now. Senator Cory Booker has been a big proponent of changing that. But what other issues do you see? What are the core issues right now as we're standing here today or sitting?
I mean, it's definitely social justice reform, it's definitely patient advocacy, and it's states' rights. You know, those are the three themes, that we're really using to push the lawsuit forward, to educate people about legalization and the benefits of legalization. There's something in it for everyone. You know, there are so many different types of ways that people are damaged by the unconstitutional classification of cannabis as a Schedule I drug. So we can address those substantive individual rights, we can address states' rights, and we need to address social justice reform.
Yeah, I would agree. Social justice issues are tremendous. They're growing in attention. They are something that it is an issue, or a set of issues rather, that has broad bipartisan support. These are issues that if you read a transcript without a name, you some days wouldn't know if it was Cory Booker or Rand Paul talking about it. There aren't many issues you can say that about. And that is something that has an opportunity, if leadership in Congress and if leadership from the president present in the right way, that they will be able to address this, make this a higher tier issue, and something that Americans, even if it doesn't affect them directly, feel like it should affect them directly, because it is brothers and sisters from communities of color who are dealing with this on a daily basis, that in a way that, as a white male who was raised in Connecticut, never faced and will never face in his life. And I think the ingredients are there for that conversation to happen. The recipe hasn't been written yet necessarily. And then, of course, taxes and banking. I'm not going to go into real depth about either, because you're going to hear more about it today and you've heard a little bit earlier. But the banking issue in particular is the one that confuses me the most. And my primary research area is not drug policy. It's studying the executive branch of the federal government. So you can imagine my life is tons of confusion at all times. But this is the most confusing thing for me. I argue that if you are a supporter of cannabis reform, you should be second in line asking for banking. If you oppose cannabis reform, you should be first in line asking for banking, because banking makes this industry more reputable, more accountable, easier for state and eventually federal regulators to audit and to investigate. And the argument that Tahira made earlier was that, and it's the right one, that the federal government is fearful that we can't have banking because of money laundering worries. Not having banking is the money laundering worry. Cash-only businesses can launder money a lot easier than an electronic system can. And so that is the upside down. If you're a Stranger Things fan, that is the upside down to me, is cannabis banking policy in the United States.
So social justice is absolutely the key issue of cannabis reform. And John mentioned it becomes more and more of an issue every day, and part of that stems from the fact that one of the main pushes for cannabis reform is social justice. But what we saw after cannabis reform was that there was not progress being made on social justice, and honestly, there was regression. What we were seeing in Colorado is that after legalization, yes, arrest rates went down, but arrest rates for people of color went up percentage-wise. And on top of that, you have now this burgeoning, this economic boom that's going to be the biggest of our lifetime, and Black and brown people and other marginalized groups are largely shut out from it. Mm-hmm. So you're looking at this kind of growing hypocrisy within the community about what the real ideals are when it comes to cannabis legalization, and making sure that economic interests and pursuits don't eclipse the real social justice and freedom aspects.
Yeah, just to highlight some of the statistics on that, people of color are so grossly underrepresented in the cannabis space. They represent maybe 3 to 5% of ownership of cannabis businesses, but they represent 75 to 80% of arrests, and that's not okay.
Yeah, I just want to touch upon a smaller issue, but coming back to the public health issue and public policy around health. Part of the complexity behind the lack of any real guidance at the federal level in part affects the vape industry. And I mention that because the same vaporizers that are used to vape propylene glycol, the big vape clouds, which I'm sure everybody in here loves, are also used for CBD oils and these things. And what happened in 2016 is that the FDA in 2009 under the Tobacco Control Act got oversight over tobacco products. And then on August 8th of 2016, they decided, actually, we're gonna loop in all the vape pens, e-cigarettes, and all the components. So, anything that goes with it. And to get your product on the market lawfully, you need to undergo an application. And the application, the pre-market tobacco application for most products, is a years-long process, and they estimated it to be about $1.2 million for each company. I was at the Tobacco Products Expo a couple of weeks ago in Vegas, and it was estimated there $330,000 for every SKU, so each product barcode. And until the FDA can say, okay, we've got a green light on cannabis, and it can also be used for this. Until they decide that certain devices can be used in vaping in general, those same devices still are prohibited from being used with anything cannabis related because cannabis is illegal. And until there is an approval, and we haven't had any approval, the FDA's actually only granted one approval since 2009, and that's for chewing tobacco. We don't have anything. And you have to have an approval by 2021, 2022, depending on the size of your company. And because they require an environmental assessment, testing of the device itself, because there's all these battery explosions that get a lot of hype in the news. So in addition to air emissions from the vape, the e-juice itself, all these pieces require so much time, including physical, trials, et cetera. I guess when I look at the industry and where it's going, I just see so many setbacks, and a lot of people, I've been told, because I do work in the vape industry, and I probably didn't mention that in the beginning, but a lot of smokers are going to vaping because it's the heat, the burning rather, versus the heating of the juice, which is so toxic with these harmful and potentially harmful constituents. So, it's impacting in this way as well.
So, Deanna, I wonder if you'd do a follow-up with me on that, because it's one of the concerns I've had too, that there's a consumer protection issue and there's also a regulatory body issue. A lot of the industry doesn't really, and Brenda talked about it earlier, it was very unsophisticated at the beginning, very immature, and there's this illusion that forever, organizations like the FDA, the EPA, OSHA, these organizations are not going to come in and sort of run roughshod over the industry and over what we're, over public safety. So can you comment on that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So, a drop of nicotine, can kill you on your skin. So, you've got these vats of nicotine in the factories. I've toured the factories. OSHA, all the checks and balances about your good manufacturing practices, which, by the way, they've yet to draft those regulations for manufacturers of tobacco products, the newly deemed products, so all the e-cigarettes, e-juice, et cetera. So in part, everyone's just sort of working in a vacuum and trying to do the best that they can. If you manufacture, you have to register with the FDA. Under the statute, so not an optional regulation, under the statute, you have to come, FDA has to come and inspect your factory. Only what are they actually coming to inspect when they themselves don't actually have any regulations to follow to say, okay, you're following this, you're not following that. Irrespective of that, they're still out enforcing. company last year, I think it was last year, importing a product. They had yet to register their product because even though you can't do your PMTA yet, they still have a requirement that you register all your products and indicate all the ingredients therein. So they said, look, these products aren't registered. U.S. Customs then is our policeman of the border, not just for people, but for companies as well, commercial goods rather. And so they said, look, we've detained these, and I think they gave them the option actually to re-export them, but oftentimes restricted merchandise is simply seized and destroyed. So there's definitely already enforcement.
Okay, so then for all of you, as we talk about rolling out this across the government, in a perfect world, what would you see happen tomorrow? Not
Deschedule.
Okay, tell me about that. Why do you want deschedule versus what some people are pushing at the federal level, which is a rescheduling,
Well,
dropping it into more of a pharmaceutical category, which would in effect wipe out the industry. So,
Well, I would think that, if they're going to reschedule it, would have to be based on actual scientific data, not racial animus. So if they want to go ahead and do that, but we're looking at cannabis, which is so safe. It's safer than alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, sugar. Does it really belong classified as a regulated substance in that way? I'm not so sure. So, no question that deschedule would address, some of the social justice issues that we've been talking about, but also really, get to the heart of, is this really something that, affects public safety or not? And I think everyone in this room can agree that cannabis is safe and medically effective.
anyone else? That's good timing.
So I'll push back a little bit. There's some descheduling legislation in the United States Congress right now, and it's all garbage. It doesn't ask, or it doesn't answer the questions about what happens the next day. And there is going to be a public expectation for some level of regulation around this plant. And so if you deschedule, it's not going to have that huge of an impact in Colorado. It is going to have a huge impact in Alabama. It is effectively going to turn that state into a home grow state off the bat, which is something that Vermont is currently experimenting with. But the people of Alabama are going to have different expectations. Maybe Alabama is a bad example if we're talking about the racialized history of this plant. But other states, this is going to have a tremendous impact on both state-level public policy and the expectations from constituents around public policy. So I think that while descheduling is certainly a proposal that is out there, descheduling has to be done right and not the way that current senators are envisioning it. One of the proposals that I think is effective around this that is not out there in Congress but is out there in the policy community is this guardrails argument, where if the federal government deschedules or effectively legalizes marijuana, they put regulatory guardrails in place within which states have to stay. So there will be a bare bones regulatory framework around cannabis, and then states fill in the blanks within there. You might have a system like Vermont, which is a home grow only system, and no commercial businesses are allowed. You might have something that has a robust regulatory system in a commercial market. You might have some other system that we don't have right now. But while I think the calls for descheduling are understandable, I think the calls to support descheduling proposals in the United States Congress are extraordinarily ill-advised.
Anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah,
I just have a follow-up. Oh, you want to comment? Go ahead. Yeah, please.
So dealing with imports means I have to deal with so many other government agencies, and I've been practicing for 15 years. The agencies are comfortable doing things that they're already comfortable doing.
Right.
And I know, looking at the DEA, that they have, have had for several years now, some no enforcement or not paying attention to certain regulations because of a lawsuit, actually. I think it was Hemp Industries, maybe from '03. But it takes a class of products and they sort of don't care about them, like body cream, with CBD in it. And I think, I don't see something sweeping happening. And even if something did, the agencies are so slow. So I think it actually might be more effective if they had classes of goods that were no longer of such importance, in terms of how do we regulate. So something not consumed by people, but maybe in a hair wash. that's fine. And as an aside, the only reason why we can buy toasted hemp seeds and put them on our salads is because they're toasted, and so the seeds are incapable of germination, so they're actually outside of the federal definition of marijuana, because I get that question, well, why do we have some hemp products and not others? And that's why.
And so, Lauren, I have a question for you. It's more about the social justice side of it. So I know you said to great applause, almost a standing ovation, if we hadn't controlled them, that you're suing Jeff Sessions. I just want to push back on that a little bit, because one of the grave concerns that we have with our practice and with our clients is that we're going to effectively start to put targets on our back that, with all due respect to what you're doing, that a lawsuit of this magnitude, the question I would ask is, why do this against Jeff Sessions rather than get to the grassroots level and come to a state like, let's say, Colorado, where I could commit a murder 5 years ago, get out of prison, and still work in the marijuana industry, but if I committed a nonviolent drug offense 5 years ago and got out with a felony, I could not work in the industry. So I'm just wondering, why go big and try to poke a bear, albeit an odd bear, and not go state to state?
Well, we're only a small firm. I'm only one person. I would love to take that case. Actually, the idea for the federal lawsuit did start with an idea of suing New York State, and then we realized that our claims were really constitutional in nature and belonged in a federal court. If we could sort of attack it from the top down, that might be a more effective strategy, because, we're just a small firm. And there are other people, too, that want to join this effort, and we welcome them. But all of those issues are valid. There are, like I said, many different categories of damages that people are suffering by this unconstitutional classification and the way that states have gone about regulating it in view of the fact that it's federally illegal. If we remove federal illegality and we allow states to experiment in ways that, they're not scared of, then we could have a much more robust industry. We do have targets on our back, and my clients certainly, some of them are supportive and some of them are scared, but for the most part, they've been really supportive. And we just have to all accept that the cannabis industry is not for the risk adverse. And if that's something that worries you, then it might not be the right space for you right now. But you have to sort of be willing to accept those risks when you do any business in the cannabis space. So why not just do it all?
Lauren, your clients had targets on their back the day before you filed that lawsuit. And if you're a person of color in this country, you have a literal target on your back with Jeff Sessions as the Attorney General of the United States.
So true.
I think that's a throwaway argument. These people are being targeted every day, whether it's a child with epilepsy or someone with cancer or someone who just wants to get high. You've got a target on your back.
Yeah, so let's remove those targets.
Yeah. So jumping off of that, do you have people you're watching right now in government that you like? People that, we talk a lot about who we don't like, starting at the top and working our way down. And I know personally from dealing with the federal government right now, it is in complete chaos, both behind the scenes and in front. We used to go there infrequently. Now we're there all the time dealing with changing pulses. So who do you like right now? Like, who are you watching? Who do you feel like has your back collectively?
We're watching, the states, Attorney General, we really want state support. So what's happening in Colorado, we're really looking at all of the U.S. attorneys, obviously, to see how they're going to exercise their discretion in view of the Sessions memorandum. But we're looking for people who support states' rights. We're looking for people who support patient advocacy. We're looking for people who support social justice reform. It's not Jeff Sessions. We can, that's basically what we're doing. But certainly, state governments who want to protect the decisions that their constituents made, states, Colorado, California, Washington, Oregon, they've come out very strongly to talk about the benefits of legalization and how it's impacted their constituents. So we're looking for support like that.
Great. Anyone else? People you're watching? People you like? Nobody.
I'm not watching any. I just sort of have been following the agencies to see who says what, and everybody's been pretty quiet, to be honest. And I took a look to see what, if any, sort of customs activity. Nothing. I looked even at, so in 2016, there was something like, I think it was 30 some odd different FDA had gone out and sent warning letters to people with their CBD creams saying, oh, we saw on your website that you claim to do this, that, and the other mitigation of pain and discomfort and whatever else. And so because you make these types of claims, it's considered a drug. You can't do that. Last year, we found 5. So, in terms of, an agency gets a new, like any company even, right? You get a new manager, they want to do their own thing, and so what was a priority is no longer a priority, or it's hush-hush now. And it's actually been fairly quiet.
Where are you watching?
Well, I think that obviously our most vocal supporters, Cory Booker, and we on the state level, Elizabeth Warren, we've been able to kind of like coax her to support medical marijuana. And I think that there's support there for adult use, but it's the difference between full-fledged support and support that would lead to, like I said before, an industry that is not quite the one that we would want. So you mentioned kind of state actors stepping up and protecting. Our governor, Charlie Baker, did step up against the rescission of the Cole memo and said that our commission would be able to move forward unfettered. But in these last 2 weeks, we've seen a really coordinated effort by his administration to influence and stifle our independent cannabis control commission in Massachusetts. And so the issue there is that we have not only licenses for very large businesses, but also mandates within our law that we fought very hard to be included. Even when the legislature tried to rewrite our ballot initiative, we were able to get extended equity and small business protections. Unfortunately, those particular license categories are under severe attack by the administration. And so we're at this kind of strange point where someone from the outside might be looking in and saying, wow, Massachusetts is moving forward, and they have the support of their governor, but when you kind of dig deeper, you'll see that there's still these real serious issues, because we know that we already have an entrenched medical marijuana system. And when we were writing our ballot initiative for adult use, there were several things that we wanted to fix and change. As I mentioned, like we saw in Colorado, was similar thing happened in Massachusetts, in that there was exclusion of anybody but very large businesses. And in Massachusetts, there were very, very, very high barriers to entry for the medical marijuana program. And a system of application and approval that was skewed towards people who are very wealthy and well-connected. And we wanted to make sure that in our adult use that we weren't replicating those same injustices. And unfortunately, right now, the push that we're seeing from the administration is to keep that status quo and to maintain that. And the talking points or the instruction to the Cannabis Control Commission are keep things simple. And unfortunately, we don't agree with that, because we know that anything other than having access for people of color, women, minorities, and veterans will lead us to legalization, but at what cost?
Excellent. Okay, so before we get to Q&A, because I want to do some of that, I want to give you all a chance to say anything I didn't ask or anything you feel like is absolutely pressing that you have to get out. And this is your moment. Imagine Jeff Sessions is about to walk in here.
So much to say.
And we're all going to prison. And you too, Brendan. You too. You're not exempt just because you win here. Just want you to know that. We're all going to jail. So this is your moment. Yeah. And I want to start with you, John, because we just ended on the end there, and work our way down. Then we're going to take questions from the audience. Just tell us, what's just this one thing you feel like, I've got to get this out. I need to say this in this format so people understand it.
So I say this not as an advocate. I'm not an advocate for or against marijuana. But what I will say is, what has impressed me over the past few years in particular is the mobilization that has happened both at the grassroots level and with support from industry to let members of Congress know what you're thinking about this. And I think as this issue, during periods in which this issue is not in the spotlight, it's not something that members are thinking about regularly, it's not something that's grabbing a lot of headlines, you write a lot of letters, you make a lot of phone calls, and you don't hear anything back. But I think what we saw with Jeff Sessions' memo was a real reaction from Colorado Senator Cory Gardner. He has transformed over time his position on this issue. But what Senator Gardner did in response to that was he used his power as an individual senator to put a hold on every single Department of Justice nominee that the president put up in the Senate as punishment, essentially, for this. It was a bold move to do as someone from the party of the president. And I think it is not something that's to pat Cory Gardner on the ass for doing a good job. It's actually this constituent connection, because he's hearing day after day after day the level of need for a variety of reasons, whether it's corporate, whether it's social justice, whether it's individual user preferences, that Coloradans care about this. They like the system they have. They want to have the protections that they enjoyed under the Cole memo or better ones. And this wasn't this profile and courage for Cory Gardner. This was Cory Gardner actually doing his job because he's heard from constituents. And so if this movement's going to be successful, it needs to keep up the work both at the grassroots and the industry level.
I know Cory, and please don't slap him on the ass. Go ahead, next.
I just want to reiterate how at the federal level it's all illegal, because all the time I have people and they come and talk to me and they're like, oh, well, I thought it was legal, or I thought it was legal here, or what about 0.3%, or what about, isn't there some like limitation, or if my THC level isn't above that, then isn't it okay? And I find myself explaining, is it 0.3 or 0.03? I think it's 0.3. It is 0.3. Explaining how, yes, in that state, because of the way that the state law is written, it actually does exempt that. But that's not actually how the federal law is written. And yes, we do have this industrial hemp law, which is in a miscellaneous provision in the FDA laws. It's not like a normal law, but it ties in having hemp, industrial hemp, with a university for research purposes, for medical, scientific, or whatever other thing. I don't have it memorized. So it's not just sort of this free-for-all. If I can prove that I've gotten it from this and it's not higher than this, that everything is fine. And Lauren mentioned how there's a lot of risk, and so I know everybody does want to dive into the business at some level, and there are ways to do that. But if you are touching the plant, there really is a lot more risk.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would just impress upon the irrationality of the classification of cannabis as a Schedule I drug. It's so irrational that it rises to a due process violation. And the trend of legalization, that we have 30 states now and, that have legalized for medical purposes, and 44, I think, if you count CBD only, and we have 9 states that have legalized for adult use purposes. That trend of legalization is no accident. Our government, even though it maintains that cannabis is appropriately scheduled as classified as Schedule I, and Jeff Sessions appears to be somewhat of a flat earther on this subject, nonetheless, the federal government has taken steps recently in the past few years to sort of induce and encourage, even advise the American public how to participate in the state legal cannabis industry. And I want to highlight 2 important ones, because those of you who are interested in going into the business of cannabis will certainly be relying very heavily on these federal pronouncements. And one of which, of course, is FinCEN guidance issued by the U.S. Treasury Department, whereby the U.S. Treasury Department is instructing financial institutions how to bank cannabis businesses that operate in compliance with state law. So if Congress really believed, or if the Treasury really believed, that cannabis was appropriately scheduled or classified as Schedule I, that would be money laundering. I mean, that would be conspiracy to violate the Controlled Substances Act. That could be entrapment. And also, we have these federal appropriations riders in effect, whereby the Appropriations Committee feels so strongly that states can safely regulate cannabis that they've stripped the Department of Justice from any funding with respect to prosecuting individuals and businesses that operate in compliance with state law. So we do have these sort of federal pronouncements that reflect the actual safety of cannabis and whether or not it's dangerous. So we're hoping that that trend continues. As far as I know, the appropriations rider enjoys broad bipartisan support. It's been routinely extended year after year, and it's used by courts as a basis to enjoin enforcement of the Controlled Substances Act against people who violate it, but they operate in compliance with state law. So this trend of legalization is no accident. We expect it will continue, and we expect more people will come to realize that it's completely irrational for cannabis to be classified as Schedule I.
So we see a lot of people who are interested in coming into the industry, and that's a great thing. It's a great thing that cannabis is an economic boom. But I see that, as Lauren mentioned before, there's a lot of risk involved in this industry. And when you move into this industry and decide that you want to be a part of it, I think it's very important that you understand the nature of this industry and the fact that it only exists because we push forward and fight for it. So if you're not ready to take on that piece, to start understanding what the law is, where you are, where you want to be, so if you're not ready to look into the ways that you as a business owner can help to change and push that law forward in the way that it should, honestly, you're going to end up being a burden on the industry, because when the rubber hits the road, you're not going to be there to support, and frankly, you might be doing things that harm the rest of us. So I think it's really important to have that understanding and know that, that this is one part business and one part making it the business, because just 10 years ago, this wasn't really a business for anybody on the adult use side at all. So that's one piece. And then piggybacking off of what John said, never before in my life have I been involved in anything where I've seen the power of the individual person's voice more. And I think that people, they see, there's all this movement and a lot going on, and they kind of wonder where their voice can be powerful. And I just want everybody to know how powerful your voice is, whether it's talking locally, talking to your neighbors, starting to get active on the municipal level or the state level. Every place needs people, and especially professionals that can start to break down the stigma of what a cannabis user is, what a cannabis business owner is, what somebody who is passionate about this policy looks like or is involved with. So I think it's great that we're all here and that you're all here, and please use your voice to help continue to make these changes.
Really good, guys. I would say it's kind of time to end that sort of renegade outlaw mentality that got us all started and start to go into that business acumen, get everybody focused, unify the system a little bit. Okay, we're going to take some questions. I have one hand up right back there, so I'm going to make you run. You said you didn't get a workout today, so you're on. He didn't really say that.
Hi, thank you all for
anybody.
this. This is super instructive. So I hope this panel can answer this question. How are the state and federal tax laws being formed in this? Maybe Colorado is an example. And then how does that look for the future with the federal tax law? Are they going to tax it on the federal level? And then further to that, how is the growers must be behaving in a black market to some extent, where if they don't pay taxes in Colorado and they sell it to somewhere else, there must be a black market, and how that's all being managed by the government and how they're thinking about that, and is that generating laws and thoughts and all the rest? Thank you.
Anybody want to grab tax code?
There's some important litigation, that's been chipping away at 280E. If that sort of stuff interests you, it interests me. Definitely take a look at that. But, under 280E, cannabis businesses can't deduct ordinary business expenses. They can only deduct cost of goods sold, which makes running a cannabis business exponentially more difficult and expensive than an ordinary business. But I think that tax reform is, a top priority for some of the heaviest hitters in the cannabis space. There's a lot of effort, a lot of lobbying. And I think that, even just over the past couple of days, there's been some pronouncements from the U.S. Treasury and, efforts to sort of protect, the current state of banking, however you want to call it, but also to have meaningful tax reform in a way that will enable these companies to flourish like ordinary businesses.
I will tell you in Colorado, you still have to pay your taxes if you run a regulated business. So there is no loophole. You can't sneak weed out the back door. Everything's seed to sale tracked from the day it's born to the day it's sold and taken out of the store. So you can't circumnavigate that system. Mm-hmm. And they're right, 280E is a tax law built on making sure you cannot deduct any taxes. So if you have a business, you still have to pay full 100% tax to the federal government. You're not allowed to deduct anything. So that's, to her point, what a lot of us are working on now to try to change that. But you still, if you run a legal business, and this is a good point you all have made, you've got to be legitimate and you've got to pay full taxes. So if you want to grow operation, you're paying 100% tax to the federal government. And don't try to pay in cash because they no longer allow that payment. So if you try to walk in smugly with your cash payment, they're going to send you on your way. So
just to be clear, they'll tax you.
Correct.
But they won't make it legal.
That's correct.
That's true for any illegal activity.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah, every illegal activity. Welcome to America.
We do
I
have...
feel a libertarian in the room back there. Like it. Who's next?
I have
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Go
another
ahead.
tax comment. So currently, if you want to import tobacco, you do have to pay a tax, and you have to do monthly reporting to the TTB, which is our Alcohol, Tobacco, Tax, and Trade Bureau. And legislation introduced last spring, maybe February, maybe winter it was, by an I think it was an Oregonian congressional member and or senator, and Rand Paul as well, and I think one or two others. They wanted to make it, I think it was the TTMB, so the now Alcohol, Tobacco, Tax, Marijuana Bureau, or marijuana, whatever. And in the same way, imports now of cannabis would be taxed as well.
We have another question. This gentleman had his hand up here as well. So we'll go him and then over to you. And right here. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you. You're right in front of me. How did I know? Actually, we're going to go him, her, him. Sorry.
All right. Thanks for taking my question. My name is Sam Tracy. I'm the director of the Connecticut Coalition to Regulate Marijuana that's pushing to legalize marijuana for adults here in Connecticut. And so thank you so much for the organizers, and this has been a great event. So my question is about Vermont. So in Connecticut, we don't have ballot initiatives. We have to pass this through the legislature. And so I'm curious what all of your thoughts are about how Vermont is going to impact these discussions we're having in legislatures across the country. Connecticut's not the only state that's doing this right now. And so Vermont is the first time that they've really proactively chosen the non-commercial model. DC had it before, but that was kind of mostly because of Congress. And so do you think that that's going to help states like Connecticut that are trying to legalize including commercial sales, or do you think that that might kind of start us in the direction of states explicitly legalizing without any commercial element to it?
I think that regardless, the fact that legislative action was taken on this is a beautiful example. So, and for, like you mentioned, states around here like Rhode Island, who have been kind of banging their heads against the wall for quite some time now. Whether it bodes well for the commercial market, I mean, obviously Vermont's its own special kind of place when it comes to how they look at people's ability to, and commercialization, capitalism. So maybe as things kind of trickle down, there'll be more balanced discussion there.
Yeah, I also think that it sort of underscores, the difference in programs that we can have, and it really, plays into states' rights. You've got a state like Vermont that wants to do one thing, and you've got a state like Colorado that wants to do another. So Connecticut now has two wonderful examples of how they can do something. They can learn from those mistakes, they can learn from what's right, and they can fashion their own program, and that's one of the beauties of federalism.
One thing to pay attention to, though, is the impact of local ordinances, and we're actually seeing this a lot with tobacco and vape. So New York City decided, okay, if you want to sell any of these products, we're going to they've just created this. They have an application. It came out January 25th. You only have until April 25th to file, and anybody who doesn't bother to is shut out. San Francisco, they're like, no more menthol. We ban it. Berkeley County. So even though there could be something statewide, then all the local ordinances, the communities get together, and by the time you even hear about it, it's already basically been decided on, against you. So something to pay attention to.
Yeah, I would just say I don't think that it's necessarily going to push states in New England or elsewhere in the direction toward the non-commercial model. I think that's still the default. I think, as Shanel said, I think Vermont's its own unique place. It's like 2 parts Brooklyn and 1 part Montana, and so I think that that independent streak in it that exists in Vermont was useful to get that model passed, but I don't think that necessarily plays in the states around it. Maybe New Hampshire, but
One thing I'll just wrap that topic up on, we see in Colorado. So Colorado sort of was the tip of the spear. By the way, a lot of people don't know it was the first arrest for illegal marijuana in the 1930s and the first to go legal in January 14. That's kind of neat. But we have a home-grow caregiver model that was built into the medical system that has wreaked havoc on diversion. So marijuana leaving the state largely comes from the home-grow model. And the way that manifests is people come together saying, we have home grows, we are caregivers, and there are 6 of them, and they buy a giant warehouse, and it ends up palletized and leaving the state. So it doesn't become an issue in the beginning. It feels fine. I mean, my own mother illegally grows weed in Ohio because it saved her life. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. But my mother in 2009 was diagnosed with cancer, started growing her own weed, and when I asked her if she was scared, she said, honey, I'm dying anyway. And she's still alive. So it's anecdotal at best. That's what the good doctor would tell me. But the point is, caregiver is a good thing, except when it's a terrible thing. And so you have to know that the ramifications are that the commercial industry will come back, I hate to be the capitalist, and they will say, hey, this is BS, that these caregivers have no regulatory structure and they're allowed to do whatever they want, and now we have legal businesses and we pay all the licensing fees. Just keep in mind, it's a dangerous animal and it's very hard to manage. It's like cobras. Okay, we're going to go right to the front here.
Hi, thank you so much for your contributions to the industry. I'm Dr. Rachel Knox, and I wear a lot of hats in this industry, but one of those is the vice chair of the Oregon Cannabis Commission. We oversee the Oregon Medical Marijuana Program. So I'm very invested in protecting patients' rights, but also the businesses that really did once exist in Oregon that have now been sort of ran out by the adult use market. And John, you specifically made some remarks about descheduling that resonated very strongly with me. And I have interesting thoughts and opinions on federal legalization as well. But if that happens, can any of you speak to how to protect these small businesses when big pharma is looming, big corporations are looming to get in, especially with federal legalization improves interstate commerce? How are we going to protect our economies in each of our states and preventing those corporations from coming in and moving everybody out?
Fantastic question.
Yeah, so I'll be honest, unless the state acts, they aren't protected. They are going to be victims of capitalism, and victims of capitalism at times are good things, and victims of capitalism also have victims, right? And so states can take steps to try to either limit canopy size or limit number of licenses that one holding can have. There are a variety of ways that you can limit the size at the top, but also to protect at the bottom, to have carve-outs at the bottom, can also protect really poorly run businesses that have no business being in this industry. And so I think there are effective ways at the state level. The feds are never going to do it, I don't think. There may be sort of attempts to avoid a Philip Morris type situation at the federal level, I mean, beyond antitrust laws. But yeah, I think there are a lot of people who are going to get pushed out of this industry, and that's a fact of capitalism. And I say that not placing any subjective judgment on that choice, but it's a reality.
Yeah, and principally I asked that question, as an entrepreneur myself, and we're speaking to a bunch of, aspiring entrepreneurs. Are you going to have a place in this industry when federal legalization rolls around? And so that's really the basis of my question. I go and talk, in a lot of conferences, and we're speaking to people to get involved in this industry, particularly people of color who already have extraordinary barriers. Are we encouraging people to get involved into an industry that's not going to be there for them in the next 2, 5, 10 years?
They have to stay in it, for that 2 to 5 years. If you're in this industry, you're an advocate, and you should be pushing for legalization on all fronts. Take a look at what's happening in California right now. You've got the most, among the most fertile. I know Oregon also has very fertile soil as well, but you've got some of the most fertile soil in the country up in Humboldt and Mendocino counties, and a lot of those growers, they don't have the internet. So how can they possibly participate in the state-mandated seed-to-sale tracking program? And yet they're the top growers, and they grow the most quality cannabis that in the world. So, but there are coalitions forming to protect them, and I think that the stronger those coalitions are, the more impact they'll have at the state level. And then, like you said, John, it's going to be up to states to protect those businesses. But we do have an intrastate market right now, so states have a little bit of a head start on the federal government. So let's keep up that pressure.
So I think it's a really poignant question, and we're seeing the conflict between even adult use and patient access and rights, even in Massachusetts, right? We'll have adult use starting in July, and there's a real fear on behalf of patients about their supply and whether or not they're going to be adequately represented in the marketplace. And what John talked about is, within the regulatory structure, having those protections there, but the federal issue throws all of that into question. And I was really happy before we moved into this Trump administration with how things were going, which was, there were still barriers on the federal level, but essentially, that duct tape had been applied, and states were really able to kind of have these little laboratories of what real good cannabis policy looked like. And that essentially insulated and protects the small business owner and entrepreneur, because while the federal government is essentially handcuffed, that looming threat of potential federal enforcement does keep those large players from really getting involved and coming in bulldozing everyone. And so, unfortunately, we're in a situation now where it looks like even the protections for the small people are somewhat at risk. But I think moving forward and continuing to push for, to essentially castrate the federal government's ability to harm states as they move forward is a great route.
I see no protection for the small player. And we can look at the vape industry. I mean, we'd be stupid to think RJ Reynolds, Altria, Philip Morris, they could be in here for that matter.
Raise your hand.
Raise your hand. Out yourself.
I mean, they have the infrastructure, they have the history, they have the connections, they have the supply chain. So, these smaller companies really need to get together. It's expensive. Running these things with all of the regulatory checks and balances, all the inspections, vetting your foreign companies who are going to be coming in, pesticides, spraying. Was it containerized at the appropriate level? How much waste do we have? Did something go moldy? I mean, there's so many issues, and it's expensive to keep it all healthy enough for consuming, because we're talking about people consuming. So I think in terms of the movement, that you really need to get organized with.
We're about to go to our last question, but I'll add a final thing. Just remember, like the beer model, there are massive companies, and then there are microbrews. That will be a very similar model, potentially. So you want to keep that focus, right?
Work is all about craft.
Absolutely, and consumers too. Certain consumer will buy Marlboro Greens, ooh, and a certain consumer will say, I reject that, and I'm going to come there. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay. So last question, and then we're going to excuse our panel right over here.
Altria, we stupid not to be here.
Joshua Warren, thank you very much.
Are you with Altria?
No, I'm independent. I'm an inventor, somebody who's just into sustainable design, and most importantly, the medical concern, because actually on a UN level, there has been medical harassment and medical prosecution, so we need to represent disabled or marginalized individuals, especially minorities. I was really questioning some of the attorneys about constitutional rights and our founding freedoms, because that's what our law is based upon. What are we doing? I mean, I see that 280E prevents us from having goods of sale, and that's the only deductions that are allowed for that business. But seeing as though businesses can have subsidiaries and other type of venture with them, can those businesses be tied in with the marijuana industry without having a legal implication? Or is that something that rides in both directions? Because, a sustainable business, should they support marijuana, are they going to be gone after because they are the founding supporters, or some sort of transitional house or living association that looks at preventing recidivism and looking towards the health aspects, because that's really what our concern is for the future, is our health and our basic human rights. And I'll leave that to the panel. Thank you.
Good final question.
I sort of see the tax issue and your right to life as distinct issues. We do have a fundamental right to life, to preserve your own life, to protect your life with life-saving medication. That's certainly one of the issues that we've addressed in our lawsuit. Taxation, yes, there is a way that you can insulate the non-touching, the aspects of your business that don't touch the plant away from the aspects of your business that do, as long as it's a true bona fide reason to do that. It's not just some sort of shell company that's designed to divert, tax money. So you certainly wouldn't want to do that. But you do see, dispensaries, for example, that take the brunt of the 280E hit. They might have a consulting business in addition to their dispensary, where they can run a lot of operational expenses through that consulting business and avoid some of the 280E impact. Or if they have a grow on site, then they can then deduct cost of goods sold for that portion of the dispensary that actually houses the cannabis. So, you're definitely able to work around it, and there's been some meaningful court decisions on the propriety of that. So we're okay with it. I shouldn't say we're okay with it, but we're dealing with it. But the right to life issue is different. The suppressive, the fact that it's a violation of due process, a violation of free speech, a violation of your right to petition your own government. If you need cannabis to live, you can't travel to the Capitol, step onto federal land, and lobby your elected officials in favor of legalization. So you have a whole class of individuals who need cannabis to live, and they're not the ones who get to lobby. So it's, there are a lot of those issues that we're raising. Hopefully we'll get to address them. But you're right. This is a human rights issue. And hopefully we're going to see some big changes soon.
Okay, great. So I want to one more time give a round of applause to John, Deanna, Lauren, Shanel. Thank you. And they're going to be around here, so please feel free to ask them questions as we leave the stage. I'm going to exit now, but I'm stealing this just to prove to my parents I was here.
Seriously.
And thank you, everyone, for being here. My name's Todd. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.